Hello and good morning, and welcome to your morning briefing for Monday, the 2nd of June, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Happy Monday and also happy June to everyone. Let's go ahead and jump into today's briefing, starting with our domestic sit rep. Well, starting off here inside the Beltway. So President Trump said that the India deal is close. It's very close. But he also was very deliberate in saying that India and Pakistan both risk a trade deal collapse if they go back to war with each other. He said, quote, he wouldn't have any interest in making a deal with either country if they're going to be at war with each other. Trump also said the administration officials will be meeting with Pakistani officials this week. Moving on to this reconciliation bill. You know what? Jared's been having internet problems. So let's see if you'll give me just a second, I'll get everything loaded back up here. Sorry about that. It's Monday, and that's just sometimes how Mondays go. There we go. All right. Monday. Thanks for bearing with me here. Moving on to this reconciliation bill. Moving through the House, it's apparently key House Republican tax negotiator, Representative James Smith, Republican from Missouri, talked about Section 899 of the budget reconciliation bill, and he called it the revenge tax. This is something that I mentioned in last week's economic early warning report, which is how the Trump administration could potentially use Section 899 of this big, beautiful bill to impose taxes on foreign countries. And I'll give you a specific example. Let's say 30-year treasuries, they're hovering right around 5% yields. If the Trump administration wanted to, they under Section 899, which has passed the House, and if it passes the Senate, they'll be able to levy a 20% tax on a foreign country on their treasury holdings, which means it effectively reduces the yield from 5% to 4%. And James Smith, this Republican from Missouri, said it will serve as a deterrent to foreign countries which attempt to impose digital services taxes on U.S. tech companies. So this would be a form of reciprocal taxation that is specifically written into this bill. So Section 899 would increase income taxes on foreign individuals and companies with investments in the United States if the Trump administration determines that the countries to which they belong are imposing, quote unquote, discriminatory digital service taxes on tech companies. This could also be weaponized as a form of leverage between the Trump administration and other countries as well. And then moving on to the Department of Energy here, they've issued their third emergency power order. And we've talked about this for a couple of weeks now. This all has to do with energy production, and this emergency order is, again, under the Federal Power Act, and they declare this on Friday. They've directed the PJM interconnection to continue operating two oil-fired power generators at a power plant in Eddystone, Pennsylvania, past their scheduled retirement date of the 31st of May. And the DOE, Department of Energy, said the order was a response to PJM interconnection concerns over increasing electricity demand and retiring baseload power plants. As a reminder, under this Clean Power Plan 2.0, we were headed, which was under Obama 1.0 and then under Biden 2.0. We were absolutely 100% headed towards a major power generation crisis in this country. It probably would have led to scheduled and unscheduled brownouts and blackouts. And the Trump administration, the Department of Energy right now is trying to make sure that does not happen. And PJM interconnection is the Mid-Atlantic, going all the way from New Jersey down to Virginia and the east coast of North Carolina, and then into the Midwest and Ohio. So the DOE said that they are developing a methodology for determining current and anticipated reserve power margins in all the grids. That is going to be announced in a report on the 7th of July. And Robert said that it sounds like to him that they're considering emergency orders for other grids as well. not just this PGM interconnection. By the way, I did a report on this a couple of years ago. We need to bring this back up because talking about reserve power margins, they are decreasing almost across the board. Reserve power margin is the difference between essentially the max capacity and the anticipated demand of a power generator. And so that reserve margin is decreasing due to power demand. I think power demands are rising like 3% a year or something like that, which is about 10% every 3 years. And so we do not have the capacity, the electrical generating capacity online that's being built out, ready to flip on. We do not have enough capacity coming online to match the demand, and that's going to continue to lead to power issues. Moving on, a Texas oil company has been accused here, the Southern District of Texas, the U.S. Attorney's Office there, announced charges against a family that operated the Rio Hondo, Texas-based Arroyo terminals on Friday. Federal authorities said Arroyo terminals smuggled nearly 3,000 oil shipments for the new generation cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación from May 22 through April 2025. And then finally here, we continue to see these reports. This poll comes out. Most recent poll came out from CNN, and it shows a number of interesting things. We already knew this stuff. It's just fascinating to watch CNN have to cover it. But this recent CNN poll shows that just 16% of Americans believe the Democratic Party has quote unquote strong leaders. 40% believe the Republican Party does. So Republicans, 40% is not a great number. Let's just be honest. Only 32% of Democrats believe their own party has strong leaders. And, I started to write out this big, long in focus this morning about Democrats are unpopular with their own base. The Democratic Party is unpopular with its own base. And there's a few reasons for that, mainly because you look at who they've run for president. I mean, Hillary Clinton, just the consummate establishment insider, swamp creature. Hillary Clinton lost to Trump. And then establishment dinosaur Biden. And then you have Kamala Harris, who was kind of this hybrid. She had one of the most liberal left-wing voting records in Senate history, but she ran under this mask of like a middle of the aisle centrist establishment Democrat. And I don't think people believed it. And if you are the left wing of the Democrat Party, so if you're the Democratic Socialist wing of the Democrat Party, you're not the establishment moderate centrist. They're becoming extremely disillusioned, probably going back to 2016 when Hillary Clinton, when the DNC nomination was probably stolen from Bernie Sanders and given to Hillary Clinton. Back in January of this year, there's a guy named Will Miniker, and he is the co-host of this leftist socialist podcast that was popular for a long time called Chapo Trap House. And he said the left liberal alliance is over. And he said the left wing of the party, your Bernie Sanders, your AOCs, even though she's actually kind of fallen out of favor with some of the left wing of the party. He basically said they tried to make a run to take control over the party, and he said the insurgency was defeated. The political insurgency was defeated, which he's absolutely right. He said that alliance is over, and so it got me thinking: at what point in time could we see a split in the Democrat Party? I don't think it's going to be in 2028, but I think it really depends on who they run, and we'll talk about that. Talk about Jamie Dimon here in just a second. But in the early 2030s, I could absolutely see the Democratic Party fracturing among the liberals, the more moderate and more moderate compared to Democratic Socialists. And I could actually see the Democratic Socialists of the party breaking off and either forming another third party or maybe joining with Democratic Socialists of America or just running as independents in their own areas and not running as Democrats and certainly not voting for Democrats. I think that day is coming. I don't think it'll be in 28. Could be early 2030s at any rate. A lot more on that in the future. Let's move on to our upcoming protest events here. I think we're up to 26 protest events today for a Monday. Pretty unusual. A few months ago, that would have been extremely abnormal. That is very much becoming the norm, that we are seeing more protests scheduled throughout the week. We had, I'll have numbers for you tomorrow. By the way, we're building out this brand new riot and protest tracker over on our new intelligence platform we're building. We're going to start beta testing that this week, and then next week we'll start adding people to it. So I'm really excited about it. It's all around a much better platform, and it's going to allow us to do a lot of the things that we wanted to do previously, but we weren't able to do. And it's, as Buzz Lightyear would say, to infinity and beyond from here. With that, let's go ahead and move on here to our global sit rep. I'm not sure if Jared is back or not. Okay, Jared, we're going to keep your camera off, I guess, so we can save on your bandwidth. What, do we have you on audio?
Yes.
Okay, great, fantastic. Well, let's go ahead and take it away.
All right. So Hamas sort of agreed to the ceasefire negotiations that Special Envoy Witkoff gave to them last week. They said they agreed to some clauses, and they're going to re-enter indirect negotiations through Qatar and Egypt. So this will be another weeks-long process to get those hammered out. A bit more importantly, the Secretary of Defense was over at the Shangri-La dialogue this weekend, and there he told all of his Asian counterparts, including the Chinese delegation that was present, that China poses a significant threat to Pacific stability and that everybody should prepare for war. Hegseth also told all of his non-Chinese counterparts that the U.S. would no longer force other countries to adopt our politics or ideology in exchange for security assistance, which is a notable change from the Biden administration and previous ones that pretty much demanded you become a democracy. And then kind of in the same theater, the European Union and the Philippines agreed to open a new security and defense dialogue after their foreign ministers met. And the EU representative reiterated a commitment to the status quo in the South China Sea. Now, what's happening here is the EU is actually pledging to uphold that status quo. That's the free and open Indo-Pacific concept. And this is significant because China would likely use the EU as a next export market to support any kind of Chinese warfare. Because in the event of a war, they're almost certainly not going to export to the rest of the Pacific and America.
Well, maybe. The question is, what are they exporting? Jared, did you happen to see, these accusations come up, and with this drone attack by Ukraine on Russia, they came up again. There's all these reports, and apparently this is now verified from multiple independent sources, that China has these, and it should come as no surprise, China has these container ships which will contain drones that they will ship towards the United States and then be able to attack us off our coast. Or, who knows if these ships are just will be sitting in a U.S. port somewhere, because they're virtually undetectable compared to other container ships, which would look very similar. And maybe it's not even that you have a container ship full of drones. Maybe it's you have several containers full of drones on multiple container ships. So it's just very concerning. But did you see that report? And also, what do you make of it?
I did. And I don't know how true they are, but technically,
I believe
in the
it 100%.
Technological sense, they're absolutely capable. The Russians have had containerized anti-ship missiles for decades. That they've just been public about that. So the Chinese almost certainly have them. They've just never been public about them. And that kind of technology is not like, if you look at the US's Typhoon missile system, kind of the same thing. So the idea that, China will do that to us. Yeah, probably. And I don't know for sure if the US has them, but it would boggle my mind if the US did not have a similar capability and it becomes a tit for tat drone war, just, through container ships. The main thing with that is that the moment you really start using container ships to conduct offensive operations, everybody wearing that flag becomes a target. So you start shooting container ships like that. That's nearly a total war guarantee. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if the Chinese would necessarily want to cross that line unless they are losing the war.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, that would make sense. And if you're Vietnam or Philippines or even maybe even some European power involved in this conflict, That potentially opens you up, your trade, your ports up to similar attacks from other countries. So it's going to be complex. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. We're going to go ahead and move on here to covering Jamie Dimon. There's a couple of reasons why I bring this up. Number one, Jamie Dimon is the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, which is the largest American bank. There's some speculation that he may make a run for president in 2028. But more importantly, I think this guy has a really good understanding of what's going on with the U.S. economy and also what's going on with the world. He gives a pretty balanced talk here. He was at the Reagan National Economic Summit over the weekend, talking about a huge range of things. I break this down. I got the whole transcript, and I pulled out the most important parts. It's in this morning's report. I want to share a few with you now. Number one, Jamie Dimon says that the biggest threat is not actually China. He says, quote, "I'm not as worried about China. China's a potential adversary. They're doing a lot of things well. They have a lot of problems. What I really worry about is us. Can we get our own act together?" And he was extremely blunt in a lot of the shortcomings and the problems that we're having. Talking about the dollar, he says fiscal mismanagement. He's talking about the federal government, state governments, pension, retirement funds. He says, quote, "All that stuff, quote, is going to kill us." I always get asked, are we going to remain the reserve currency? And he says, no. If we're not the preeminent military and economy in 40 years, we will not be the reserve currency. That's just a fact. Read history. And he continues, "Now, I think we will be. Warren Buffett would tell you we're enormously resilient. I agree. But this time is different. This time we have to get our act together and quickly." Moving on to, by the way, I think we all know the lobbying problem in D.C. is an issue, but he talked about 13,000 lobbying groups in D.C., all kind of jostling and negotiating for their little carve-outs. And he says this is part of the problem. This is why the budgets get so large, because you have all these lobbyists asking for $1 billion here or $50 billion here, $20 billion there. And then there's 13,000 lobbying groups, and then eventually you add up, and that's how you get not just a multi-trillion-dollar budget, but $1 trillion deficit. So I think he's very stark, very blunt on what these issues are. Talking about bond vigilantes here, he says, quote, "You are going to see a crack in the bond market. Okay, it's going to happen. It's going to happen, and you're going to panic." I'm not going to panic, he says. But he continues, "When those tectonic plates shift, it's very hard to see in real time. It is shifting, and this is one of them. I just don't know if it's going to be a crisis in 6 months or 6 years." We've been talking a lot about the bond market. We'll continue to talk about the bond market because it is going to experience a problem. Jamie Dimon also says that what he sees in the future is inflationary. And then finishing up here, I didn't see any of this was hyperbolic, but I do really look at this as pretty even keel. He says a lot of things that are frankly optimistic. And so I look at this almost like a campaign speech. He's very plain spoken about what's going wrong and what needs to be fixed and how to fix it. And he was serious about the United States having some major problems that it does need to solve, but he did appear optimistic that a better future is achievable. And, I look at him and it's not the same, from a lot of these financial commentators. I watch all the YouTube videos, and it's like always doom and gloom, and the world's going to end tomorrow. And, maybe it will. It eventually will. We're eventually going to have major problems in this country. But Jamie Dimon seemed to think that, maybe we can muddle our way through this. I'm not so sure about that, but we will see. By the way, and just to reiterate, this does sound to me like a guy who wants to run for president. All right, moving on here. The United States and China traded accusations over violations of the trade truce over the weekend. The Chinese Commerce Ministry said the Trump administration has, quote, seriously undermined and violated the U.S.-China tariff truce when the Trump administration revoked those visas for Chinese students, and also they are restricting semiconductor technology exports to China. On Friday, President Trump accused China of violating the truce by delaying critical mineral exports to the United States. And Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was on one of the Sunday morning talk shows, and he said, quote, "What China is doing is they are holding back products that are essential for the industrial supply chains of India, of Europe, and that is not what a reliable partner does." So the Chinese here appear angry because the Trump administration officials are reportedly drafting a new sanctions rule to prevent Chinese semiconductor manufacturers from evading sanctions by creating subsidiary companies. China's very good at this, evading sanctions by just creating these brand new companies that do not appear linked to what they're really linked to. And some anonymous sources that were quoted in several media outlets said that the Trump administration is likely going to impose even more sanctions on some major Chinese companies after this rule is made public. One last note here. Over the weekend, White House AI czar David Sachs, he's on one of the co-hosts of the All In podcast. He said he thinks the Chinese have about a 30% chance of winning the AI race to artificial general intelligence. And so whenever we look at what technologies and what semiconductors are being restricted on, are being restricted to China, it really is to maintain a U.S. advantage. This is something that U.S. Officials, they cannot allow China to win the race to AGI. I'm not sure anyone needs to win the race to AGI, but I mean, I guess if it's got to be anybody, it probably shouldn't be the Chinese. Moving on. The Trump administration is also announcing that they're going to remove some Biden-era blocks on Alaskan energy here. And this all has to do with a rule that blocks oil and gas development in the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska. One of the things we've talked about previously is both the United States and Canada, especially in Alaska, trying to build improve West Coast oil and gas exports. So improving those export terminals so that they can supply Indo-Pacific allies that are 100% dependent on energy imports. So this would be oil and gas, probably predominantly going to Taiwan, to Japan, to the Philippines, maybe some other countries. And in a time of war, you just greatly reduce that supply chain and try to ensure that we're getting our allies the oil and gas they need. Moving on to this terror attack over the weekend, the FBI is investigating this. Apparently, there's a flamethrower and some Molotov cocktails involved. There's an Egyptian, or at least reported Egyptian national, who attacked a pro-Israel or Jewish demonstration over the weekend. 45-year-old Egyptian national Mohammed Suleiman. The Department of Homeland Security said that he entered the U.S. on a non-immigrant visa in 2022. He may have been seeking asylum at the time, and he was granted a federal work permit that expired in March 2025. And so this guy is being accused of using a homemade flamethrower and threw what appeared to be some Molotov cocktails into a crowd of pro-Israel demonstrators. You know, this is something a former contracting buddy of mine from Afghanistan is actually in Gaza right now. I was texting him over the weekend, and I just asked him, like, is this really as bad as it sounds? Because we all see the American media reports about what's going on in Israel and Gaza. And he seemed to say it's just kind of like the Wild West over there in terms of what the Israelis are doing in Gaza. And so I'd look at that. And these accusations of genocide or ethnic cleansing by the Israeli Defense Force, and then you get the media coverage, and then we already have this pro, in some cases probably pro-Hamas movement, but definitely pro-Palestine movement here. And it is, I mean, no pun intended, it's incendiary. And so I look at this, and I think it really is driving these violent responses against Jewish and pro-Israeli demonstrators. And each of these attacks, I think this probably goes back to the Mangione assassination of the United Healthcare CEO. Each of these attacks lowers the barrier to future violence. And so I look at this Operation Gideon's Chariots that's still going on in Gaza. Obviously, will get worse before it gets better. That means attacks here in the United States could also get worse before they get better. Apparently, the Israelis are still dropping lots of ordnance in Gaza also. All right, with that, let's go ahead and move on to the next item. Jared, probably the biggest news over the weekend. I think this is the biggest news weekend I can recall, at least in recent memory. We have Ukraine launching a pretty devastating drone attack against Russia. What happened?
Yes, it was actually a whole series of them. So in these attacks, I'm I haven't been able to get a hard number on how many different attacks there were, but there were several. They destroyed dozens of Russian strategic and nuclear bombers. So those are A-50s, Tu-95s, Tu-22s, all of which are very important for the Russian military and their relations with the United States. And they destroyed some Russian Northern Fleet submarines. I haven't gotten confirmation whether those were part of the nuclear triad or just, like attack submarines. But nevertheless, they did attack submarines up there.
Mm. So,
Now,
Jared, you have here on the slide Ukraine upsets nuclear balance of power. That really seems to be the case because many of these aircraft that were damaged, well, not just damaged, just destroyed now, they are nuclear capable bombers. They're bombers capable of carrying nuclear payloads, nuclear weapons. And you look at that nuclear balance of power between Russia and its NATO adversaries. This is an extremely big deal here, especially if you're NATO.
absolutely. The when it comes to nuclear forces, you allow effectively your enemy to come and inspect, to come to know where they are, so that there's no perception of a surprise attack. And now the Russians can't do that as well. They don't have these now. That does upset the balance of power. Now the U.S. is pretty much, without question, the preeminent nuclear power, and that's going to make Russia very nervous. They don't want to be on the back foot. So I think Russia's going to strike back. They have to strike back. They have to do something.
That's going to be devastating. I was thinking about that last night. I'm like, what? Zelensky better be, 1,000 feet underground or something at this point, or maybe even not in Ukraine anymore.
I would say he should definitely leave Ukraine and try to find a way to project like he is in Ukraine. And reportedly, by the way, I'm still waiting on confirmation on this, but President Trump reportedly didn't even know about this attack coming out, which I think has a lot of implications. First off, when Russia attacks, if they can say, okay, the U.S., the head of the West, did not know, then they will likely keep their retaliation to inside of Ukraine. If President Trump did know, and they have reason to believe that, the U.S. coordinated this in any fashion, I don't see how you wouldn't consider moving outside of Ukraine. Nevertheless, my biggest worry is that they touch off a nuke inside of Ukraine, because this is attacking the nuclear triad. They've threatened the use of nukes in the past.
That is the red line. If you go back and you read Russian nuclear doctrine, that is their nuclear. That's the threshold for use of nuclear reprisal, retaliation.
And the Northern Fleet is nowhere near the front line either. They had to pass Moscow to get to that fleet. So this is about, really, it's name a red line. Ukraine has just crossed it. It would not shock me to see at least one nuclear weapon touched off in the near future. I don't think it's likely, but it wouldn't shock me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it would be shocking to the world, considering we haven't seen the use of a nuclear weapon in, I don't know, since what, Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Yeah. August 1945.
It will change, not just change warfare. I mean, it will change how every country looks at that, because now a lot of other countries are going to be extremely incentivized to get their own nuclear weapons. So I think that's something that would be extremely dangerous, not just if you're Kiev, but also just for every country that has a major adversary next door. A lot of countries are going to start looking for nuclear weapons, including probably like Saudi Arabia and some others.
Yeah.
Because once that nuclear threshold gets crossed, I mean, I think it makes future nuclear. I wouldn't say it makes future nuclear strikes more likely. It would at least normalize the possibility of nuclear weapons, which has been previously just something that you wouldn't expect is going to happen. Yeah. All right, Jared. Any other insights into what's going on here?
Well, when it comes to the idea of nuclear doctrine changing, I think the Russians could play this smartly by using the escalate to de-escalate. If they do decide to go nuclear, which technically they could, if they used a non-tactical nuclear weapon, a true devastating nuclear weapon inside of Ukraine that could possibly prevent a a mass proliferation, because if they use a tactical level 1, then we would see people go, oh, technically I can do this. It's, it wouldn't necessarily lead to the end of the world if people had tactical nukes, which means that we could potentially see a city wiped out for Russia if they match their doctrine on that.
This is something, going back, I think if you're Russian President Vladimir Putin, you're facing somewhat of a dilemma here. This to me has European NATO written all over it. I think Ukraine obviously had to have had some help, and we don't know all the details, but I look at this and I say, well, who is actually pressing for this? And more than anything, cui bono, who benefits from this? Nobody benefits more. NATO countries in Europe benefit far more than Ukraine does. Kiev is about to look like Gaza potentially, and which means flattened buildings, even more so than Russia has already done. And so Ukraine probably doesn't benefit from this. I saw where Zelensky came out and said, "Oh yeah, we're ready for peace discussions now." There's no way, there's a 0% chance of that happening. This is not, and all these European leaders, I think, seem to think like, oh, you have to press. This is how you gain leverage. I look at like Bill Kristol and all these neocons on Twitter, and they're just like, this is how, Ukraine didn't have the cards, and suddenly they have all the cards now. Ukraine still doesn't have the cards. Ukraine is about to have pieces of a couple of cards they had left. So I look at this, and this is extremely escalatory. It's very risky. NATO countries benefit the most from this because now they don't have to worry about these Russian nuclear bombers. We've heard from the Baltic countries now, and they've said they expect a Russian invasion, or expect Russia could invade. First it was 5 or 10 years, now then it was 5 or 6 years. Now some are saying in just 2 or 3 years. You have the German defense minister say Russia is capable of invading Europe or invading NATO countries in, what was it? It was just like last night, like just 3 or 4 years away or something like that. Mm-hmm. Nobody benefits more than these NATO countries here, that these Russian strategic nuclear bombers and the Russian Northern Fleet, they're just kind of catastrophic losses here in terms of force projection.
I think you're highlighting a very important point. It's the European NATO countries that benefit the most out of this. The U.S. Trying to switch to the Pacific absolutely does not benefit from this attack. Yes, now it is the undisputed nuclear power. That's not what the strategic goal was. The goal was to move to the Indo-Pacific, and now that might not be feasible now.
Yep. The goal was to wind this war down between Ukraine and Russia so that the United States could pivot. So I want to get back to this somewhat of a dilemma that I think that Putin probably faces. Number one, you have President Trump, who's been pursuing peace. I mean, peace at almost any cost, like peace to the cost of Ukraine, where they just say, all right, Russia can have whatever you've annexed, just have it. Like, let's just stop fighting this war. And the Europeans have been extremely opposed to that. And so this, to me, again, this just has like European NATO countries handwriting, like fingerprints all over it. And that is the dilemma if you are Putin, because if you find out that this was enabled somehow by NATO intelligence, I don't see how it was not enabled by NATO intelligence. But now your dilemma is, what do you do? If you're Putin, I don't think you can just allow these NATO countries to do this to you. So all these people just like seals, just like clapping for World War III. It's insane to me, but that's where we are. All right, Jared, any other final comments here, and we'll move on.
Nope. Looks like we're going to hit a whole lot on the questions anyway.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll start with this question. How likely is it that NATO has been materially involved in these last few attacks? Well, I think it was last week, NATO said that they are going to remove some range restrictions on some of these munitions. So they're probably talking like Storm Shadows and whatever other kinds of munitions. I remember for a long time they'd kind of placed restrictions on the range of these attacks because they didn't want Ukraine striking into Moscow. And so Ukraine just turned around and started doing that with the drones. And I said at the time, that will not materially change the course of the war. I mean, that is not just, Ukraine is not going to win just because they can shoot some storm shadows further. This materially changes the course of the war. I mean, this may end up lengthening the war far more than it would have otherwise. if Zelensky did do this on behalf of NATO or at the encouragement of NATO, maybe he's doing it to save face, but it's kind of like being pinned down by a bully that's like, 200 pounds more than you. And, and you've like flick him on the eye or something. It's like, yeah. Or you poke his eye out. You're not going to make peace with that guy anymore. That's kind of how I see it. Jared, just looking, realistically, how likely is it that NATO has been materially involved? So materially involved, I would say, is not just intelligence, providing targeting data or doing the finding and fixing, those are kind of intelligence activities for Ukraine. I would say 100%.
Yeah,
Materially involved, providing munitions. Obviously, NATO has been doing that. But what's your take on this?
I don't see how they weren't. I mean, you're talking about a war-torn country developing a brand new technology in the middle of a war and then deploying it inside of 18 months. Like, that wasn't just Ukraine. How strong is Ukraine's manufacturing sector? It was just last week, I think, on Friday, I saw that the Germans and Ukrainians were talking about developing missiles and drones together. Like, they probably were already doing that. And it wouldn't shock me to find out that some of these NATO European countries did help with this. It frankly wouldn't at all. And I guess the main dilemma there for Russia would be, okay, well, who do I attack to bear the responsibility of this? And can I attack any part of NATO in retaliation without triggering Article 5 if I can prove that they did this?
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe they do. Maybe SVR or somebody, GRU, someone, a Russian intelligence agency comes out and provides proof. Of course, it'll be denied. But, I, for one, would be at least interested in, and maybe it's true, maybe it's not. I mean, frankly, we're talking about the Russians here. But that's, maybe something I expect. Yeah, I mean, I think if you're Russia, you want to be able to justify pointing out what happened, which is this is an act of war. If this did happen, if NATO did materially provide assistance to Ukraine to carry out this attack, then I would think that is an act of war by NATO against Russia. If you're Russia, you have to make that case.
Yeah.
All right. Let's go ahead and move on, Jared, to some other questions and topics. All right. On Friday, EWR talked about Iran nuclear talks. Is it possible to lease small modular reactors to Iran that are controlled and operated by the UN to get them to agree to any deals or negotiations? I don't know. I doubt we put that technology in Iran, frankly. Jared, I would think that's guarded technology. I mean, like highly sensitive.
Almost certainly, but it also wouldn't even match what Iran's going for. They want to be able to run their own nuclear program, and they're willing to have it overseen but not operated by somebody else. And these would have to be operated by somebody else.
Mm-hmm. All right. And by the way, there's a pretty strong reaction, I think, to the stuff I said about Jamie Dimon. Jamie Dimon seems apolitical to me. I believe he's motivated by a strong business environment, will align as required to accomplish his capitalist ambition. Thoughts? Well, he did say he was an unabashed capitalist here at this Reagan Economic Forum. And listen, Jamie Dimon has obviously been maybe one of the best CEOs, at least financial CEOs for sure, maybe among the best CEOs in history at JP Morgan Chase. So I look at, first of all, I do hope the Trump administration is listening to Jamie Dimon. If Dimon is providing his view of what's going on, I think more than anything, the Trump administration needs to be hearing from people outside of DC, people who live in the quote unquote real world. Not that Jamie Dimon lives in the real world, but you can tell Jamie Dimon talks to a lot of people, and they've got small businesses, they got big businesses, just loans. I mean, they're in every financial services industry. And so I think they have their ear to the ground on a lot of things. And you just look at the success of J.P. Morgan Chase, and it's like, well, I mean, that's the. I'm not saying I would vote for the guy, but that's the kind of guy you want advising your Treasury Secretary, or advising your economic team. And so, I don't know. I don't know how apolitically he does appear to me apolitical. It seems like he's more likely to run as a Democrat than a Republican. But going back to the lack of leadership, I'm not saying that this is a prediction. And maybe if you're, I don't know that Democrats would want to turn their party over to a banker either. I think that would be extremely unpopular. But if you're trying to, if dissatisfaction among Democrats with the Democrat Party is as bad as it sounds, and it sounds really bad, then I don't see why you could not have a Jamie Dimon run in your primary, even just to test the waters. And maybe that's exactly what the Democrat Party needs. They probably need to dump a lot of this Schumer, Pelosi, Biden, Hillary Clinton, insider, Donna Brazile, insider control over the party, and maybe look to outside and maybe regain some credibility, because I do think there's a massive credibility gap for Democrats here. And we can see that by these continued polls, and even Democrats hate the Democrat Party. So they obviously need to do something that it's not more of the same, because they've gotten more of the same since Hillary Clinton, and they stole the 2020 election. But other than that, it did not work out for them. I mean, Trump beat Kamala Harris worse than he beat Hillary Clinton. So at any rate, Dimon's a bankster sleazebag. I don't know. I've got a lot of respect for Jamie Dimon because he's just been extremely successful, obviously. Yeah, so while I dislike him, Dimon is still preferable to many of the leaders we've had to suffer through. You know what? At least he is not at least he's not a DC. He may be a swamp creature, but at least he's not a DC swamp creature. But I tell you what, you go through and you watch that whole video of him, and I acknowledge that what people say and what people actually believe or talk about or do behind closed doors can be two different things. But he just seems extremely pragmatic about the U.S. economic situation, about empowering small business, just no nonsense, doing things. He came out and he was against the 13,000 lobbyists in D.C. He says, look, that's one of the major problems why our deficits and the debt is so large. You just have 13,000 lobbyist organizations trying to get their 1, 5, 10, 20 billion, $50 billion carve outs and cutouts and, special interests into these bills. And that's how you get all this bloat. So I would actually welcome someone taking some hedge clippers to the DC lobbyists, honestly. All right, next question, Jared. All right, this attack seems to be more of a benefit to U.S. NATO than Ukraine. Yeah, absolutely. Much greater benefit to NATO. It seems like an attack on the Su-30s and 25s would have had more of an effect on the front. Listen, I don't know. I think targeting Russian strategic bombers, I mean, they're called strategic for a reason. And so I think that would have had, I think if you're Ukraine, well, let me just say this. If you're NATO and you had the choice between destroying some Su-30s and destroying some Russian nuclear bombers, you're going to take the strategic bombers every time, Jared.
If you're NATO, yes. And absolutely, Ukraine, it doesn't make sense to attack these. Particularly, I keep going back to this Northern Fleet because they're not even involved. And Turkey from the beginning has said, if you are a ship that's not from Sevastopol, we're not letting you in. So those submarines cannot attack Ukraine in any capacity.
And
so
the Russian Northern Fleet, that's the Arctic fleet.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
So it benefits the U.S. and NATO more than Ukraine. Absolutely, at least for the NATO countries, because these things could not have attacked Ukraine.
Right.
As far as CIA up versus Ukraine, I don't know if it would be a CIA. I doubt it.
Well, I mean, I think you just have to go back and look at the Trump administration reasoning. If it was done by CIA, it either got the approval of President Trump, which was bad, or it didn't get the approval of President Trump, which is even worse. But honestly, I don't see how this could have happened without stamp of approval from Trump. So I just look at this and say, does this meet Trump's ultimate objective in that theater, which is to end the war? I don't think it brings us closer to ending the war. And therefore, I just don't see any reason why the U.S. would be behind it. All right, given the serious repercussions of this strike, does this give Trump an excuse to wash his hands of the whole thing and tell Ukraine they're on their own, or is it still politically difficult?
I think if they can conclusively say, and honestly say, we had no involvement in this, we the Trump administration absolutely, condemn what you just did, then maybe the Trump administration can wash their hands and walk away. That would require leaving Europe on their own, and we would see who in Europe actually wants to continue that war without the United States backing them.
Well, this certainly complicates things for the Trump administration. I mean, we really are trying to focus on China. I think Trump has been, very clear, publicly clear with Putin, with all his Truth Social posts about calling Putin a madman and saying Putin's making peace talks impossible. Peace talks are definitely impossible now. Actually, honestly, I think if you're President Trump, you are just extremely livid at NATO for doing this. I mean, I think this had to have been done maybe behind Trump's back, but definitely unilaterally, it seems to me. I think it's more likely than not that this was done unilaterally by some NATO countries and done without the approval of President Trump. All right, let's move on because there's a bunch of other stuff too we got to get to. Is the USA into a recession? I guess the question is over a recession, cutting interest rates, political leverage, market reset, and blame shifting. Is this the pain that is coming? Well, I don't know. I hear some billionaires talking about 3% economic growth later this year, which is not impossible. I know we were on track. It looked like we were on track for a recession. That has receded. Goldman Sachs last week, they trimmed down their 12-month recession outlook from 45% down to 35%. Now they're looking at like maybe plus 1%. Actually, you know what? You remember when the Atlanta Fed runs this thing called GDP Now? You remember when it went negative and everyone started to freak out? You know what the Atlanta Fed GDP Now estimate is for Q2? It's 3.8%. It's almost 4%. Now this is annualized growth here, but the Atlanta Fed GDP Now estimate was negative for weeks, and I told everyone it would bounce. There's no way it could stay that negative for that long, and I did not expect that it would be 3.8%, but that's where it's at. Not that I think it's an accurate read, because it was not accurate when it was negative for so long. But at any rate, I think people are talking about a bounce in the economy now. Consumer sentiment jumped like 13 points or something for May. It beat estimates. Estimates were like at 87 for the consumer confidence index, and it's like at 96 or something now. So maybe we are seeing a bounce. I don't know. Tough to say. There's still a lot of pain out there. At any rate, inflation, I think, is baked in. A bunch of people, like probably 90% of the people I follow, are saying inflation. The other 10% are saying deflation. I don't know. Hard to say. Maybe deflation eventually. Like people are talking about AI being deflationary, and you have all this automated work, and if you're a food, this is something that is it Jason Friedberg or whatever the other guy on the All In podcast is. He said, you have all these AI driven, like automated food preparation companies and services. And now you don't have to pay a workforce because you got robots and AI doing all this stuff. And he said, if you don't have, other than your capital expenditure for the machinery, payroll is your next largest, one of your largest expenses. And he said, now if you don't have to pay employees, maybe a cheeseburger is not $8. Maybe a cheeseburger ends up being $2. And so, I think he expects food prices to come down immensely eventually, which is deflationary. But in a lot of other places, we're seeing inflation. So I don't know. In terms of the pain that's coming, I think 90% of people say higher inflation. Jamie Dimon, higher inflation. All these people saying higher inflation. It's going to get worse before it gets better. And then we have Jamie Dimon saying there's going to be a bond crisis. He doesn't know if it's going to be in 6 months or 6 years, but we're obviously headed towards a massive fiscal crisis in this country. I mean, Republicans, the GOP, the party of fiscal conservatism, the party of the deficit hawks, they're still running their own bills are running 6% deficits, budget deficits. And you just cannot continue that on indefinitely. I mean, we're basically we're in a lose-lose situation, or maybe a win-lose situation. Who wins though? In the first scenario, you have essentially austerity. You go the Elon Musk route, you just try to cut everything. Elon Musk said very, very well put over the weekend. He said, you can have a big bill or you can have a beautiful bill. You cannot have a big, beautiful bill. But that's exactly what we get. And even in the Senate, they're still going to be running budget deficits after the Senate gets done with this reconciliation bill here in the next few 2-3 weeks. So that's option number one is austerity. Option number two is you continue to run the deficits that we're running. And we talked about last week, in 10 years, we're probably looking at like $65, $70 trillion worth of national debt. This big, beautiful bill alone is supposed to add $22 trillion over 10 years. Plus you get higher borrowing costs. Every 1% borrowing costs increase adds another 4% of interest costs over the next 10 years. That $4 trillion in interest costs over the next 10 years. That $4 trillion in added costs, that's debt. We have to go into debt to pay that. We're going into debt to be able to finance the debt we have. So at $65-70 trillion, we're past that 150% debt to GDP threshold. Maybe we can grow our way out. I think I said last week, I kind of doubt we grow our way out of this. I think the realistic goal is to grow the GDP in a way that makes the debt sustainable. But really, I mean, all we're talking about is whether the Fed's going to have to print 50 trillion or, maybe 49 trillion. I don't know. It's a pretty bleak outlook. So yeah, all that stuff is the pain that's coming. At any rate, let's move on. If you had to put a percentage on the likelihood of a limited nuclear exchange between Russia and Ukraine, what would it be? And the same regarding Russia hitting strategic NATO asset. I don't know, Jared. I think it's generally low likelihood of, a nuclear exchange. Ukraine doesn't have any nuclear weapons, so that we know of at least. So I'm not sure what the likelihood of an exchange is, but a tactical nuke or some kind of limited nuclear strike on Ukraine, Jared, I don't know, percent-wise, what do you think?
This is going to sound, so keeping in mind this is in Ukraine only, I ballpark it at 10%. Just because, and I just dropped this in our private chat, that what Ukraine just showed Russia was, hey, we can touch 2 of your nuclear triad legs, and at least 1 is now severely degraded. Russia may feel like it doesn't have a choice because it might not have a nuclear capability. This was a failure on Russia's part. So I think that ups the chances that they touch off a nuke in Ukraine. As far as a nuke in NATO, less than 1%.
Yeah, I think it's effectively.
I mean,
0%.
that you're talking about an actual nuclear exchange. We go back to the 1700s technology-wise.
Yeah, well, yeah, global trade and all the rest. Yeah, I don't know, Jared. I'm really surprised. I mean, I'm kind of shocked that Russia would just have all those bombers just like parked out on the tarmac somewhere, or parked in a parking lot or whatever the Air Force equivalent is, and they're not in hardened structures. Knowing, I mean, this was obviously a massive intelligence failure, but I'm just shocked that they were just sitting out there, literally like sitting ducks, considering the possibility. I mean, Ukraine's been launching drones into Moscow for a year now, or however long.
Yeah, 2 years. But so I saw on Twitter somebody point out, hey, there's which I don't know this for sure. It would match some of the doctrines I have seen. But supposedly there's an agreement to leave strategic nuclear bombers out in order to be seen by the opposing forces. So the US and Russia leave them out. That way there's no like, hey, where did they go? Surprise attack, here's a nuke.
Okay, so is the second order effect now going to be the nuclear observation treaty, whatever it's called, is could effectively end here with Russia?
That, you know, if they can actually point to NATO being involved in this more than just providing material, but material intelligence coordination.
Yeah, because
we're
supposed to allow satellites, and I don't know if this is still ongoing. I think there was some I think some side was trying to end this, but we're supposed to have satellites in having some level of observation of these nuclear assets, just so each side says, okay, well, they're not turned on, like everything's copacetic. I don't know, frankly, if you're Russia, if that's still going on, I don't see how that nuclear treaty survives.
Yeah, I don't think so either. One practical example of this kind of behavior, though, is the what is it, the Open Skies Agreement or something like that. Basically,
yeah, that's the one.
The Russians and Americans each fly strategic bombers down their coasts, and that happens every summer. So we actually should be seeing it this month. If we don't see that, I'm going to be very worried, because that would mean that Russia's either moving those bombers, or they don't trust us to maintain that treaty anymore.
Yeah, and listen, if you're the Trump administration, you're trying to gain stability, not instability with Russia. This is just extremely destabilizing in many incalculable number of ways. I just can't possibly see how the Trump administration. I mean, I would be throwing things across the room if I were President Trump right now. I think it's somewhat obvious that NATO did this behind President Trump's back, and I think they are risking World War III. I mean, this is just inconceivable that they would do this. At any rate, Jared, although Russia can build more, potentially, I don't know how long it's going to take them. I mean, these are like extremely expensive aircraft. How much would you say? I think I saw the number. I don't recall. I also don't want to say, just in case I'm way off. But you have any thoughts on Russia buying Chinese bombers to rebuild their capabilities? What is the Chinese equivalent here?
It's the H6. H6, I believe, is a copy of the Tu-22. It's a one for one. It's a licensed copy of one of the Russian strategic bombers. Could Russia buy Chinese bombers? Sure, and they could integrate it to their fleet. Would they? I don't think so. That has, to my knowledge, not happened ever. It's always been Russian technology to China, not Chinese copies to Russia. And keeping in mind, Russia and China are begrudging friends. That would effectively give China an enormous in on any kind of Russian, nuclear deterrence.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I think if you're Russia, you want domestically produced as much as you can. I mean, especially because these are like modern aircraft. This is not like Cold War era Soviet type technology in many cases.
Yeah. Peter Provenzo in the chat says it's the copy of the Tu-16, and that Chinese bomber tech is not as good as Russia's, which may be true, but more importantly, yes, it's an in. You don't become you don't become dependent on the Chinese when the Chinese have a territory dispute with you.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'd like to see a discussion on the financial impact of the big, beautiful bill in light of the positive impact of the Reagan-Laffer lowering marginal tax rates that increase tax receipts. Seen any analysis on it? I haven't seen any recent analysis, but I've seen lots of people talking about it, including Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. And all of the Republicans who are pressed on the CBO scoring of the bill, the Congressional Budget Offices, there's two types of scoring. There's static and there's dynamic. And CBO only uses static scoring. So they look at a bill and they just say, well, this is the cost for year 1 and year 2 and year 3 all the way up to year 10. And they say, okay, they add all that up and say, okay, well, this is the total cost. It's $22 trillion over 10 years. That's what the big, beautiful bill is in static scoring. Now, the dynamic scoring that Republicans are talking about would include added tax receipts because the more economic activity you have and the more economic growth you have, in theory, the more people would be paying into taxes. And so that increased tax revenue would then be deducted from the total cost, because now you are funding whatever cost you have over 10 years. And that CBO doesn't use that. And as a matter of fact, the reason why CBO scoring in general is so bad over the long term especially is because they do not consider the likelihood of recession. A lot of these CBO scoring in previous years has been based on like 3.5% interest rates. And there's just a lot of really bad assumptions that are made in the CBO scoring. So just because some CBO scores something doesn't mean that it sounds bad. It doesn't mean that it's as bad, but it could be worse. It could be better. And that's the point that Republicans are making, is that you reduce regulation, you put more money into the hands of business owners. That's the other thing too, that many Republicans and the Trump administration officials specifically have said. You know, all these political pundits, they come out and say, oh, you're giving tax breaks to the wealthy. And something that Scott Besson said over the weekend is, well, if you look at who's actually getting some of the best tax deals, it's the small business owners. And yeah, they're wealthy because they run successful small businesses. They're also doing most of the hiring in this country. And you want them to have extra money because they're going to go out and expand their business and hire more people. And that's how you get job creation. You do not get job creation by taxing these people into oblivion, which is what other people want to do. So listen, I don't know. I think we're all familiar with the Laffer curve and what happened under Reagan. And this is something that Trump tried to do. They were talking about growing our way out of the debt during the first Trump administration. Maybe they were doing that. I think there's some evidence that they probably were. They did at least have some limited success until COVID. So, I mean, but everyone, frankly, ought to be keeping their fingers crossed that Art Laffer is right and that we will see the United States. We're not going to grow our way out of this problem, but we can at least grow our way out of some of the unsustainability of our current trajectory. But they're going all in. The Trump, this is the Trump administration Hail Mary. And if you're against it, I have to ask yourself, why is this person against it? It's the only way out. It's the least painful way out. I will say that. It's the least. There are many other more painful ways out. This is the least painful way. All right. Any other questions, Jared?
Not that I'm seeing. My chat's been updating really sporadically though.
Okay, no problem. All right. Well, gosh, we're over an hour anyway already. So everyone, hey, thanks so much for the support. We appreciate it. This week, but I'm going to post something over up on the Early Warning Network. If you'd like to help us beta test this new intelligence platform, we'd love to have you. Go in there, look around. I think we've got some guide, like a guide for you that Rob built out. Rob's the newest team member. It's not Robert. I'm filling in for Robert for the next few days. But this other guy, Rob, is a longtime friend of mine. He came on board to build out this new platform. It's fantastic. It's everything we wanted to do with the current Early Warning Network intelligence platform, but we're unable to. This is custom built. It's absolutely fantastic. It's going to enable us to do everything we wanted to do previously and a lot more as we grow. And Frank, there's just some real, like in our phase 2 and phase 3 stuff, there's some extremely exciting stuff coming up. So we want to get beta testers on there, clicking around, figure out what breaks, and if it breaks, we can fix it. And then probably like at some point later this month, we're going to go ahead and move on and roll this whole thing out for everyone. So we'd love to have you join us. Thus endeth my update. That's going to do it for today's morning briefing. We appreciate your support. Thanks for watching and hanging out with us. Thanks for the chat. Good chats, good questions. And with that, we'll be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on this show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front. Jared popped off. Happy Monday, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.